Okay. Good evening and welcome to another event at the Channel Islands Maritime Museum Speaker Series. This evening we are pleased to welcome Mark Frees back to this forum. He's a longtime and very active docent here at the museum. Now, he characterizes himself as an amateur historian and a longtime drinker. So, no doubt the latter will come in handy this evening, for Mark will take us back to the history of rum running, the background leading up to Prohibition, the Roaring '20s, and how Prohibition affected our Central California coast. And he also promises to include stories of some of the colorful characters of that time. So let's welcome Mark Frees.
Thank you very much. Good to be here again. And this is actually kind of a rehash of a presentation I did maybe 3 years ago or something. No. Hopefully I've retained some of that information. So well, let's get started here. Prohibition lasted for 13 years. The 18th Amendment was passed 100 years ago. And along with the 19th Amendment, which provided for the vote, the right to vote to women. Now let's get some historical background here. Now, World War I ended in 1918, and we were on the second wave of the Spanish flu pandemic. Sound familiar? Now, in that pandemic, there was actually two waves. It had nothing to do with Spain, even they called it the Spanish flu. Spain was the first, there was a Spanish newspaper, the first to report on it, which is why it got the name Spanish flu. It had nothing to do with Spain. Actually, it was generated in Kansas, here in America. And it wafted through it came out of a military base and infected, the new recruits. They got shipped off to Europe, spread all through Europe, and continued to spread here within, in America. After the war, when the troops came back, there was a second wave that was actually more lethal than the first wave. It ended up over 600,000 Americans lost their lives in that pandemic. Over 600,000. And Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, he kind of ignored the influenza because his focus was on World War I, getting World War I, completed, victory overseas. So he didn't really pay too much attention to the pandemic, but extremely lethal. You hear that coming up, today, people talking about the Spanish flu pandemic, because we're in the middle of a pandemic right now. So, interesting times. It's funny how history repeats itself. Okay, let's get started here. Well, Prohibition came about because we'd become a nation of drunkards. After the Civil War, the nation had a large influx of European tourists, by the 1870s or so. And industry was going in the cities and things. Some 1 in 3 Americans were recent immigrants. So the immigrants came and they brought their alcohol-making traditions with them. And, of course, the alcohol business was booming, and saloons, popped up, on every street. And basically, husbands were spending their money and their time getting drunk in the bars rather than going home and taking care of their families. So it really became kind of a problem at home. That's why the wives started the Christian Temperance Unit. Now, in the beginning of the colonial times, people made just basically beer and cider, But after a while, and grain production increased, and there was a surplus, That left grains available for grain distilled spirits. We're talking mostly whiskeys here. And the temperance unit was basically started and headed by Carrie Nation. She carried a Bible in one hand and a hatchet in the other. And this is a saloon in Kansas that she wrecked. So she wasn't a gentlewoman, I don't think so. Anyway, this went on for a long time. I mean, the Women's Temperance League, and then, like I said, later the Anti-Saloon League. That picture is actually in the exhibit here, if you'll come up to see it sometime. That pretty much says it. I don't know if I'd want to kiss any of those. And this was a march by the Anti-Saloon League. So the growing momentum, was building towards a dry country. And so by 1919, I think it was fall of 1919, the 18th Amendment was adopted and ratified, I think, and then it went into effect in January of 1920. Lasted for 13 years, and there were some ways to get around Prohibition. And so, people found different ways to do that. Here's the headlines here from the American issue, January 21st, 1919. They're voted dry. Okay, and it goes into effect the following year. People had about a year's time to prepare for this. In fact, hijacked shipments of booze, started disappearing, already. So people were positioning themselves, So, enter the Roaring '20s and the Jazz Age, as it was called sometimes. That's not jazz. Anyway, so there was a whole new, language that came into the American, vocabulary. Speakeasies, oh, there we go. I want to go back here a little ways. Oh. Anyway, I had a nice picture of the Cotton Club, but I guess I can't find it. There's Louis Armstrong. Everybody recognizes Louis Armstrong, old Satchmo. And, of course, Duke Ellington. So this is still with us. This is, what's the remnants of Prohibition. This great music, from this purely American musical art form, jazz. We have that with us, and that's been cherished, and that'll, continue on for at least another 100 years, believe me. And in fact, it was the regiment from Harlem that went overseas, to Paris, to France, during World War I, and their band introduced Europe to jazz. It was extremely well accepted, and France has been jazz fans ever since. In fact, a lot of jazz players and jazz performers ended up moving to France. They were treated much better there than they were here in their own country. Bessie Smith, 1923. That's a picture there. So there was a whole host of groups. Paul Whitehead was really popular at the time, and these big bands and started. Good stuff. Oh, there's the Cotton Club down in Harlem. I don't know if that place is still there or not. Never been to New York, so I can't say. Oh, and gangsters. Prohibition opened the door for organized crime to develop here in the country. And, of course, you know, he's probably the most recognized gangster of that period. Al Capone, you know, basically owned all of Chicago. And a lot of stories about that fellow. And the only thing they could convict him on was tax evasion. And actually, personal income tax really hadn't been in effect too long. In fact, with the loss of tax revenue, we're talking about the federal government here, they lost a lot of tax revenue coming from saloons, you know, and the sale of alcohol, you know. So I think it was the 16th, the 17th Amendment there gave the Congress the right, you know, the government the right to tax, you know, tax citizens. Anyway, that really came into effect at that time to kind of make up for the loss of tax revenue from liquor sales. And it's been with us ever since. So, you know, the big cities, they had their organized crimes and their crime bosses. You know, up here, maybe not so much. I mean, there were, you know, different, you know, people in the business. I don't know how they all ended up being Italian, you know. In fact, Richard Sennett told me that Largo Messina was in the business, you know, here. And then after Prohibition, they became legitimate, you know, liquor distributors, which was kind of a natural, you know, progression there. So. Okay. Like I said, there were sort of loopholes in in Prohibition. One was that wine could be dispensed for religious purposes. So, you know, church attendance and attendance at the temples and things, you know, increased. And these self-professed rabbis would kind of show up here, you know, Rabbi Jones, Rabbi Smith. Now, also pharmacists could disperse whiskey. So, especially in the big cities, you saw a big increase in pharmacies opening up. And in most drugstores you can go into and you could buy beer making equipment, you know, everything you need and instructions to make beer. Because you could make beer and wine at home, okay? So the law was you couldn't make it and sell it. So a lot of people, you know, made homebrew in the basements, and I remember stories of my grandfather. He used to pay my mother and her friends to, you know, for dandelions, to pick dandelions, and he'd make wine out of it. So there are ways around things. Oh, let's see if I can think of anything else here. But anyway, people work these angles, you know, pretty well. One of our volunteers here, she told me that her father used to deliver wine, you know, to make a few extra bucks for the family. See? So the opportunities abound. And, but, you know, and also every two-bit, you know, criminal, Prohibition gave them a new line of work. So they had a whole new profession, you know. And some of these bootleggers, you know, not so much the moonshine, but I think the bootleggers, you know, they were cutting their alcohol with grain alcohol with wood alcohol, you know, which is like rubbing alcohol. The stuff will make you sick. And so hospitalizations from alcohol poisoning increased, you know, a lot in some areas. And one of the negative effects. Okay, like I said, still operations. Most of the canyons, you know, provided a source of fresh water and wood for fire to fire up the stills. So all you need is some grain to make some sour mash. You know, corn was easy to come by. It makes a great sour mash. It's got a lot of sugar in it. And this is a still operation that was broken up in Santa Paula Canyon. And apparently there was a lot of activity up in the Oaks area, which is now called the Oaks, which is actually kind of a very kind of prestigious little area there in Santa Paula. Very picturesque, but apparently there was a lot of activity up that way. Now, when you consider Ventura County in the 1920s was about maybe 25,000, for the whole county. We're looking at about over 850,000 today. And we'll see what this new census shows up here for 2020. So, it was a much smaller place, but it was growing. You certainly had agriculture, but oil, the production of oil got to be, a big major thing. You had you had fields in the Sespe, back up in the Sespe there, and then, later the Ventura Anticline out here on, the Ventura Avenue, take Highway 33. And that continues all the way up the Rincon. And that whole formation, goes all the way up the Rincon there. So that stuff was, really big and attracting a lot of people, to the area. And if you know anything about oil men, they work hard and they drink hard. So, not little stories of little roadhouses and stuff back up 33 there, and bordellos and Casita Springs, places like that. So it was still kind of the Wild West. But most of the activity, all the excitement happened offshore here. This is a Coast Guard cutter that arrested this Canadian rum runner, which actually just looks kind of almost like a tugboat trawler. Anyway, a lot of boats made their way down, medium and large, with shipments of Canadian alcohol. And the kind of stuff that, in the popular clubs and things like that, mostly in the LA market, and kind of stuff people demanded, Scotch whiskeys, Canadian whiskeys, gin. And there was a certain amount that came up from Mexico, too. But a lot of activity here. We had at least 150 miles of unprotected coastline that smugglers could use. That they would either go out and rendezvous with these ships offshore in the channel, and or they would come ashore, and drop off shipments, or a smaller boat would go out and meet them and bring it ashore. As long as you had coastal access, a road to coastal access. And actually the drive, from Los Angeles up here along the Coast Highway was pretty treacherous in some places, It took a long time in some cases. I imagine a lot of cases there were shipments that made ashore. In fact, I know so. There were shipments that made ashore and there was nobody there. The truck wasn't there yet. So they buried, the cash, there on the beach. And sometimes they came and retrieved it, and sometimes they didn't. In fact, up into the 50s, they would, occasionally after a storm, they'd find bottles of whiskey here along the beach, down along, Point Magoo area there, the Rincon, Goleta area and things, Or they'd be excavating for a foundation for a new beach house, and they'd run across a case of whiskey. So anyway, it carried on, well into the 50s, I understand. So it was a pretty active spot. There's a story about there was a suspicious boat that was tied up at the Miramar Pier up there in Santa Barbara, kind of just north of the Miramar, hotel. And some people reported a suspicious-looking boat, at the pier there. So they dispatched this Coast Guard vessel, I think, out of Santa Barbara Harbor, and there was a pursuit, that took place down the coast. In fact, people in Summerlin, were able to watch this, this water pursuit going down the hill. Now, some of these gangsters, some of these, smugglers, they'd spend the money and they would buy and soup up boats, make them very fast so they could outrun the law. And in some cases, they would iron plate them, just like the ironclads from the Civil War. Because, there was gunfire exchanged. You know, in fact, this boat didn't heave until they probably fired some rounds, you know, over the bow. And they shot up a couple of them, actually. The Channel Islands out here offered opportunities to hide out, you know, or to rendezvous. So this is the Coast Guard report relating to this thing. And this is 1930, February 3rd, 1930. Northern Exchange overhauled, this is 10 miles off of San Nicolas Island by the Coast Guard Patrol. The craft, in absence of any papers, being held for investigation. A crew of 3, Captain James Tate, Thomas Hansen, and an engineer. Photo shows Coast Guard Patrol. Held for investigation. You know, they found some whiskey. Actually, this full slide didn't get on there. Up above there, they kind of talked about what they found on board. But I'm sure they got rid of a lot because they didn't really find that much, but enough to confiscate the boat and send them to court. And this is actually Ventura, San Buenaventura, in 1936. This is 3 years after Prohibition. And you can see there's not too much activity down on the beach. I mean, that's Seaward Avenue right there. And some of those old buildings there, just before the shoreline, some of those are still there. And the pier is no longer there. I think there was a tidal surge that showed up, you know, after this, and actually went all the way up to the bluffs here, and rearranged the whole pier pond area. They had to kind of remap it and everything like that. They changed streets, and but anyway, opportunities abounded. In fact, there's the story of a local resident who was taking a walk down the beach there in Pierpont Bay. And he was stopped by a man standing on the beach there. This is late at night. Who started questioning him. You know, what are you doing down here? And he goes, oh, I'm just going for a walk. And he says, you want a job? After he realized that the guy was not a policeman. And so he agreed. And so he helped unload the shipment offshore and onto a truck. So I just got home and his wife said, where the hell have you been? He says, forget about it, honey. Look what I brought home. Now, there were always gambling. There were gambling ships also offshore here. Off of Santa Barbara, there was the Miss Hollywood. This was during Prohibition. And people could go out there, and it was drinks, dice, and dames. You know? So people could go out there and fill up their flasks and, you know, spend some money gambling and then come in ashore. They stayed just outside the, you know, the federal waters, you know, jurisdiction. And actually they operated, actually I believe into the 50s. There's the wrecks there. And basically it was a converted, I think, fishing barge. You know, and they built that structure on top, and they would ferry customers out there, you know, from the shore, you know, usually from some kind of landing or pier. The one that was in Santa Barbara, the Miss Hollywood, there was, it got a lot of unfavorable press, and it affected business, so they up and moved it down south to larger markets down there. But the Rex was very famous, and off of Santa Monica. This one was off Santa Monica. There were some off of, you know, Orange County coast, and there's some remnants of an old gambling ship that ran aground there in Orange County there that you can find sometimes, you know, at lower tides, you know, or after a storm. You know, you can see some of the framing of the ship. You know. So, and that was run by, you know, the local mobster syndicates of Los Angeles. There's an interior shot and the action there going on. Looks pretty brisk. And there's the casino there with no one in it. Now back on shore, not only was alcohol a problem, but people finding other ways to get high as well. So here's this was a huge bust found in Oxnard on A Street of marijuana in 1925. August. Actually, 24. Anyway, that was a big deal. If you go by A Street today, you can't imagine how somebody could possibly get away with an acre or 2 acres of this stuff growing. They planted corn around the perimeter to hide the thing, but apparently got tipped off, and the local authorities showed up, and it was a big deal. This is very bad stuff. You think alcohol is bad? This stuff is. Oh, some of our local color here in the area. I've got a couple people to talk about. This is Sally Stanford, who actually never married Mr. Stanford, but she was the Grand Madam of San Francisco. She became a very famous celebrity in her own right. But she had her humble beginnings here in little old Ventura County. She grew up in Oregon, Eastern Oregon, and married a fellow. She was, gosh, I think only 15. I think her first husband, and he was an accountant for mining companies, and so they got married and rented an apartment in someplace else and outfitted it, things like that. Well, it turned out he was embezzling money from these mining operations, and the $15 check that she spent on a toaster, electric toaster, she received stolen property. So she went to jail, Oregon State Jail, for a $15 check that she had no clue of. Anyway, she got quite an education there from the rest of the girls in jail. And one of them told me you could make a bunch of money bootlegging. So anyway, she got out and she moved to Santa Paula, California. She had a relative, I believe, out there, and met another man who was working the oil field out of the Piru area, back up in the Sespe. Anyway, that didn't last long, and so she kind of got fed up with men and decided to start bootlegging. So in her home in Santa Paula, she would mix up 5 gallons of clear alcohol in the bathtub. They called bathtub gin, but actually it was bathtub bourbon. She'd buy her alcohol. She'd talk about in her book how she'd go up to she called it the Rincon, or the county line. A lot of people called it. Buy her alcohol there. And the place was right on the county line. In fact, it was designated right on the floor there. So that if the Santa Barbara sheriff showed up, everybody would move to the Ventura side. Vice versa. If the Ventura authorities showed up, everybody moved to the Santa Barbara side. So anyway, she would take this 5-gallon can, dump it into her bathtub, add some caramel coloring, bourbon flavoring extract, and bottle the stuff up and let it age for about 48 hours, and it was good to go. So anyway, so she supplied a lot of thirsty people and made a good profit. She was quite a businesswoman, it turned out. And then eventually moved up into Ventura and opened up an establishment where she sold alcohol and also probably ran girls, kind of indication that was going on. And she operated there. She'd close up early by 10 p.m. so as not to arouse suspicion. And operated there for a while. She would roast up a bunch of real salty chickens every night and feed her patrons this salty chicken. Of course, drink more beer when you eat more salty things. That's why you find peanuts and pretzels and things at the bar, right? So she did quite well with that. And the probation department, they'd kind of check up on her from time to time. They were keeping, kind of close tabs on her. And she'd been raided a couple times, but she was always smart, and she'd bury whatever she had, in the backyard, by the rose bushes before they'd show up. And then she met a man who was an attorney from San Francisco. And she hooked up with him, and he helped her with some legal issues that she had, She had something down in the LA courts or something like that. He tried to help her with that. But anyway, she ended up moving to San Francisco with this fellow. And with her profits that she made in Ventura, she bought an establishment in San Francisco, which in the 1920s was, wide open. It was the Barbary Coast all over again. And so she opened up, had a very swanky establishment, fine restaurant, accommodations, bar, and also, had a little bordello on the side, and entertained celebrities, and even kicked out Humphrey Bogart for being drunken and unruly in one of her establishments one night. So she became very well known, certainly around the state. And then got into politics, ran a number of times till she finally got elected to the Sausalito City Council. And she was very pro-business, and she donated to a lot of local charities, things like that, and supported business owners. And I believe actually kind of became the mayor at one time. But a very colorful individual. And San Francisco was just the place for her, I think. And that's her in San Francisco, behind the bar. Sally. She used about 24 names in her lifetime. Was married 7 times, and beat 17 arrests in her career. So she had something going for her. Now, another local personality that I want to talk about tonight is Lucy Hicks Anderson. Now, here she is with authorities. Let me tell you the story that led up to this point here. She showed up, she was born in Kentucky, and kind of made her way from Kentucky to Texas, through the Southwest, and eventually California. And by 1920, she showed up, and she was 34. She was very talented as a hostess and as a cook. Won awards for her baking. Hosted a number of parties for some of the large families, farming families here in the area. The McGraths and A-Levies, quite a list. And so she was and quite a businessman, and had quite a reputation at the time. And the money she made from hostessing parties and whatever, she bought a boarding house in Oxnard and turned it into a bordello where she sold alcohol. Operated that for quite some while. She lived in Oxnard until about 1946. She hosted parties, going away parties for soldiers going off, to war, and during World War II. And like I said, quite a community supporter. Anyway. In the 1940s, probably about maybe 44, 45, there were a number of military bases in the area, obviously at that time. And there was an outbreak of venereal disease that broke out in one of the bases. And it was traced back to her establishment back at home. So anyway, so the judge ordered all the women to be examined. Not only the girls working there, but also Lucy herself. So when that happened, it became publicly known that Lucy was actually a Lucius. She was a transsexual, Can you imagine in the 1920s and 1930s? Huh? But nobody knew. She always insisted that she was a woman. And actually her parents, based on her, the doctor's advice, raise her like a girl. And they did. So as far as she was concerned, she was a woman. She married this guy Anderson, who was a retired soldier. And she was spending his military pension checks. Well, when they realized that she was a he, the whole marriage between Anderson and her was a fraud. And so she was receiving fraudulent money, from the government. As a result, she got convicted and sent to jail. And she spent, I don't know, some 6 years, I think, in Los Angeles, Los Angeles jails, and then ended up spending the rest of her, years in Los Angeles. I read where she wanted to come back to Oxnard, but they said no, 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 no. So she finished out her time in Los Angeles. But that's Lucy Hicks Anderson. Interesting story. Now, there was also, speakeasies in towns. In fact, there's a speakeasy from Oxnard that's still working today, still operating today. It's the 1901, and it was actually a speakeasy during Prohibition in Oxnard, and it's over in the Heritage Square complex there. I think it's downstairs below the restaurant Dulce Vita. So, and they've played the whole, Prohibition thing up, the whole theme in there and such. So, stop in sometime for a gin Ricky. Okay, where are we here? Oh, another player at that time was Robert E. Clark. Roy Clark. He went by Roy Clark. He was the probation sheriff during this period of time. And, from 1920 to 1933. And after Prohibition, he left the sheriff's department and worked as a U.S. Marshal down in Los Angeles, L.A. County. In fact, his character shows up in a movie, Jack Nicholson, John Huston, Chinatown. If you've ever seen that movie. It's all based on, kind of factual information. The names were changed to protect the innocent. And so his character shows up in that movie. Not a very flattering individual, according to the movie. But he was the last of the frontier sheriffs, this guy. The last of the frontier lawmen. He had quite a career. He was a ranger for the Forestry Service, the Park Service. Had been personally decorated by Teddy Roosevelt for breaking up a horse wrestling ring. Spent some time in Arizona. He was a wagon driver, stage driver. He could handle teams of 4 and 6. And knew the likes of Wyatt Earp, Tucson area, Tucson territory. And then moved back to California and worked in the Forestry Service, and then took the job as sheriff here in Ventura County during this period of time. Wore a 10-gallon Stetson hat, and his grandson became Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Interior, William Clark. So, a bit of a history there. So anyway, that's old Sheriff Roy Clark. And you read, some of the background on him, and it's all very favorable stuff. But, law enforcement, and, they stood to make some money, during Prohibition, simply by not doing their job. Now, there'd usually be arrests, right around election time, just before the election time. But they're basically, a lot of times the attitude was, don't kill any tax-paying voters and leave us some. So Prohibition was not a popular law locally in good parts of the country. In fact, one of our volunteers here, Mark Casebolt, he told me this story that would circulate around his family. He had a great uncle in Iowa who got a knock on the door one night from the sheriff. And his uncle answers the door and says, "What's up?" And he says, "Well, I just thought I'd give you a heads up. They're scheduled to raid you tomorrow." So he goes, "All right, well, thanks for the tip." So anyway, so he hid all of his stuff. So when they did show up, they didn't find anything. So. Okay, that's Roy Clark there. And we got a little more to talk about with him down the road here. We got another photograph that's kind of revealing. And here it is. This pretty much kind of spells out, what the atmosphere around here was. Now this is a photograph. All right, there's Sheriff Clark there, kind of in the middle, with a big cowboy hat on. Next to the deputy with the badge there and the other guy in the suit. The largest haul of contraband on the Pacific coast. 65 drums of 196 proof alcohol taken by Sheriff R.E. Clark and deputies at the foot of Arnold Road between Hueneme and Port Mugu, October 1st, 1925. Turned over to the U.S. Customs Department later there in October 1995, valued at $67,600. So that's the Ventura County courthouse. Of course, it's the city courthouse now. And there are the barrels. Well, this largest haul actually was originally 130 barrels. This alcohol was found by a group of hunters. And we're going down there to do some duck hunting. Kind of marshy areas, duck hunting's a long history, And they discovered 130 barrels on the beach. They estimate might have washed ashore. It might have been a shipment on a barge that maybe got loose in a storm or something, and came loose and floated ashore, or possibly even jettisoned, who knows, to escape the law. But anyway, they found 130 barrels, and the next day, when the authorities showed up, there was 90 barrels. That's a difference of 40 barrels. And then when the Sheriff's Department showed up, the authorities to actually, load it up and take it over to the garage here, the county garage, there were 72 barrels counted. And you can see at the time of this picture, it says 65 barrels. So somebody had some explaining to do. But that kind of sort of sums up what the attitude was around here. Finders, keepers, losers, weepers, as they say. And by 1933, the 18th Amendment had been repealed. FDR was elected president in 1932. By 1933, the law was appealed. Because it just didn't work. It just didn't work. And it made outlaws and criminals of common citizens that ordinarily, wouldn't. And corrupted police departments and, individuals. Created an illegal black market. Syndicated crime, gangsters. So it was the grand experiment that didn't work. So by 1933, the 18th Amendment was repealed. The only amendment that's ever been repealed, and the only amendment that restricted rights and freedoms of American people. All the other amendments kind of spell out, rights and freedoms of individuals. So, like I said, it was a grand experiment, but it didn't work. And, aside from, the negatives, there was, women basically weren't allowed in saloons. But the speakeasies during Prohibition, changed all that. So alcoholism among women increased considerably. And alcohol poisoning, from bad alcohol that was coming out of, unscrupulous, bootleggers. They would mix, grain alcohol with wood alcohol, which is like rubbing alcohol, which will make you very sick and, can kill you. So that was the other negative side. A lot of hospitalizations from alcohol poisoning during this period. Well, that's it, folks. That's my presentation here for your evenings. Thank you for your patience. Thanks you for coming to listen. And wake up, Jerry.